This is apropos. French deputies have introduced a bill aimed at removing the statute of limitations for crimes against children. Under current legislation, survivors of rape can pursue legal action up to 30 years after the day they turn 18. The bill follows the publication of a parliamentary report which found that 160,000 children are victims of sexual violence in France each year. Eliza Herbert has more.
Shock, disassociation, shame and fear can often delay victims of child sexual abuse from speaking out. But in France, they have a deadline for when they can file a complaint, 30 years after they turn 18. It's a time frame these demonstrators feel is too short.
It takes time to reclaim one's history. 50% of victims emerge from dissociative amnesia, often around the age of 50, and 50 is past the statute of limitations, since it's currently 48 years.
On Wednesday, a parliamentary report recommended removing the statute of limitations for crimes committed against minors. Its authors say it's also about ensuring justice.
We must not let the perpetrators think they'll be able to live their lives comfortably. We must put them in a state of discomfort.
In 2023, an independent commission found that nearly 160,000 children are victims of sexual violence in France every year, and a part of what advocates are referring to as a public health epidemic across Europe, where 1 in 5 children today are subject to some kind of sexual violence in their lives. That's more than 16 million people across the bloc's 27 states, according to a report titled Justice Unleashed. Yet only 6 countries, the UK, Ireland, Cyprus, Denmark, Belgium and Georgia, have no criminal statute of limitations for all or most child sex offences. Another 10 have abolished it for just some crimes. The report's authors have called it a postcode lottery on whether victims can access effective remedial action, and say that public disclosure can prevent future abuses and reoffences. Critics, however, are concerned it will create a backlog of legal cases.
To discuss, we're joined now by child rights activist Mié Kohiyama, the co-founder of the Brave movement. Mié, thanks so much for being with us on the programme. You yourself were affected by the statute of limitations. Just talk to us a little bit about the main legal challenges when it comes to dealing with what we might call historical cases of child abuse, and how do these challenges affect survivors?
Well, the problem is that when you're affected by child sexual violence as children, you suffer from a lot of impact, especially psychological impact. There is also in your feature, you talked about what we call dissociative amnesia, meaning that those crimes create a lot of stress, and the memory of the crimes will be stored in a part of the brain, and it will take many years, even decades, before the memory of the crime surge. And so statute of limitation are there to prevent those survivors and victims to press charges when they are able to do so.
And in terms of these recommendations that were made by the Parliamentary Commission, what kind of impact would these proposals, if you can talk to us a little bit about some of them, what kind of impact would they have on ongoing or even future legal cases?
So it's, as you know, the law in France is not what we call retroactive, so it doesn't apply to past crimes. It will only apply to future generations. So this is a very important societal reform to enforce. This is only a bill. It hasn't been voted yet. But what it means, it's that the future generations of children who will be affected by those crimes will be able to have access to justice. And that is very, very important.
And not everybody would agree that there should be changes made to the statute of limitations. What are the main arguments against extending it or removing it when it comes to child abuse cases?
So there are a lot of traditional so-called arguments against. Some people say that after sometimes evidence are disappearing, but in matters of child sexual violence, there's no witness, there's no DNA that is, that you have in a moment. Usually those crimes are secret crimes behind closed doors. So the evidence in those kind of stories disappear after a couple of days. So, and usually also those kind of perpetrators, child perpetrators, are committing a lot of crimes, serial crimes. And for example, there was a famous case in France around a surgeon that has sexually abused over 300 children over 30 years. So it is not fair to say that evidence disappear in such cases.
And I was going to ask you about that case and also this other scandal affecting a church with former Prime Minister of France was actually based. Have these kind of scandals, these big stories that have been reported, have they influenced the debate here in France when it comes to how these kind of cases and allegations of child abuse are actually dealt with?
Absolutely, it had a huge influence in the case of the Catholic school of Bétarame that you were speaking about. There are more than 200 survivors. Only 2 of them are not affected by statute of limitations. And we have seen members of parliament, I'm thinking especially about a socialist member of parliament who was a former lawyer, who was totally opposed to abolishing statute of limitation, but she was really affected, emotionally affected. She met Bétarame survivors, she talked to them, she saw how traumatizing it is not of having access to justice when you're able to press charges, when you want to press charges. And she has totally since then changed her mind about statute of limitation, and now she's in favor of abolishing it.
And the 2 cases that we're referring to here, they weren't happening back in the dark and distant past. They're both, relatively speaking, quite recent. So why is it taking so long, and why has it taken so long for any kind of, these kind of recommendations to actually be put into law and for legislation to change to better protect survivors?
That's a very good question. And I think that for a long time in France, there was a lot of, how do you say, the mindset of the legislator was very influenced by purely judicial thinking. And I think because of the Me Too movement, because of the awareness that now we have about the expansion of such crimes, and you spoke about 160,000 children that are affected by sexual violence, little by little, those sexual crimes and this public health issue is considered in a much wider aspect, not only judicial aspect, but also societal aspect. And once again, after many, many years, you can still press charges because those kind of perpetrators do continue to commit crimes over the years. And so the more the years are passing, the more you can have victims, and the more you can be able to convict and have a trial for those perpetrators.
And how does the statute of limitations and the whole issue of allegations of child abuse differ in France to other European countries? We saw in that report that there's only a handful really that have abolished altogether the criminal statute of limitations for cases involving children.
Yes, well, actually, among the 27 EU member states, 16 countries have totally abolished statute of limitation for any sex crimes on children, or at least on the most serious sexual crimes. So France is a bit, I would say, average in the sense that in France, you have until 48 years old to press charges in case of sexual crimes on children. So France is not very well placed in the EU and can make a lot of improvement, I would say. And there are a lot of studies, especially I'm thinking about a German study, which shows that survivors of sexual crimes on children disclose at an average age of 52. So France is not in a good place on this question.
And Mié, do you think that there should be certain measures put in place to avoid wrongful accusations? Because you also need to balance, don't you, the interests of people who say they're victims, people who are survivors of abuse, and those who are accused of it.
So this question, this issue of false accusation is sometimes raised, but actually there are international studies which shows that only a handful of them exist in the world, like less than 6% of false accusations of rapes. And in general, the most serious problem is not the false accusation, but it's the impunity, the major impunity of those crimes, which enable these crimes to continue. In France, like there is less than 1% of those sexual crimes on children that come to a court that are judged. So this is the major problem. The impunity is the major problem, not the false accusations of rapes.
And in cases not only involving children, of course, as well, it's right across the board often when it comes to allegations of rape and sexual abuse. Mié, thank you so much for being with us on the programme. We do appreciate your time. That's child rights activist Mié Kohiyama, co-founder of the Brave Movement.